Hello and welcome once again to Intro to Computer Games and Simulations here at Lorain County Community College. I am Mike Substelny, your instructor for this rapidly ending term. Today we are near the very end of our adventure together and we're going to talk about object-oriented programming and the game maker language. You need to know some GML to do the last few labs in this class. And the instructors of the subsequent classes in our computer game and simulation design degree have told me that the students have a little trouble grasping some of the concepts of object-oriented programming. So today we're going to go over some of the basic vocabulary of object-oriented programming in the context of things that you already know and maybe a few new things. Today will be the last new material we present in this class. Next week we're going to do the final exam review. There will be no new material. So let's talk about the computer game and simulation design degree. You should be in the first semester here taking Math 171, CMPR 166. This class, raster-based imaging, psychology, sociology elective, and SDev 101 if you're a candidate to get the degree. And next semester you should be taking the science elective, Flash, or emergent platforms game where we teach you about how to do mobile platform games. And then after that, object-oriented programming and 3D gaming, modeling animations. And then after that, your last semester, you would get the serious games class, advanced game programming, 3D level design, etc. And of those classes, all of these that are circled in red, here, and here, all involve some object-oriented programming. So it's important to be cognizant of how that works. Now, we used to require you to do some exercises in Alice to learn some object-oriented programming. I've taken that out of this class because I didn't want you to have to buy another textbook for the class, but I invite you to go out and get Alice. It's a very easy to use 3D developing language. It wasn't necessarily made for games, but it is excellent for making very simple games. And if you're in the industry, you could use Alice for rapid prototyping of 3D games. You could sit down and make yourself, for example, a first-person shooter in a couple of hours. Very much like using GameMaker, drag and drop stuff. It's available for free from Carnegie Mellon. You'll not be graded on anything in Alice this term, but I do invite you to play around with it. It's fun. So, what is object-oriented programming? It is computer programming based around the concept of quote-unquote objects. An object is a data structure with data fields, methods, and interactions built into that data structure that all kind of go together. Here's Alice code of an object called the sheriff. The sheriff can move, turn, roll, resize, say, think, play a sound, move to, etc. Those are things that that data structure can do. Now you have used some of these object data structures in GameMaker. We're going to go deeper into those structures now to get a better concept of what they are. An object is a bundle of data, functions, procedures that surround, are related to, kind of simulate a real world concept. For example, in Wingman Sam, you would have an object called Plane 1. It's an object. You've called it an object. You've had them since the very first week, and they can do a bunch of different things. And when these things happen, when these events happen, different actions will take place. You should be kind of used to that now. Let's talk about, does GameMaker allow you to do object-oriented programming? Shorter answer is most programmers say no. Long answer is yeah, sort of. You do object-oriented programming in GameMaker. For example, inheritance is an object-oriented programming concept, and inheritance also works in GameMaker. Remember, if you're working on your pyramid panic, you've got these objects called beetle and mummy that both inherit characteristics from their parent called enemy. So you see, the parent of mummy is enemy. The parent of beetle is enemy. And you should be used to that, though. So GameMaker calls enemy, the parent, a parent object. Object-oriented programming would call enemy a class. So that's a new term for you. A class is like a parent object. Both use the words parent and inheritance. So GameMaker uses that. Object-oriented programming uses parent and inheritance. But GameMaker hasn't said the word class to you yet. Objects of the same class do have many of the same properties, and you will be quizzed on this. For example, fireballs in evil clutches always have the same speed and move in the same direction, and a collision with a fireball destroys a demon. But each fireball is an instance of the fireball class in object-oriented terms. Yes, this fireball is moving the same speed and the same direction as that fireball, and either one of them will destroy a demon if it touches it. But this fireball has its own X and Y coordinates. This fireball has a different set of X and Y coordinates at the same time. So they are both instances of the fireball class. So they are instances of the same object in GameMaker terms. Objects of the same class might not be identical copies. Consider the big legs in Super Rainbow Reef. There were a couple of different kinds of big legs. The parent is destroyed by a collision with the pop object. And there's a count of the parent object to determine if you move to the next room. Now, a child inherits these properties, plus this version of it moves. It starts out moving, and if it touches a boundary, it starts moving in the opposite direction. Like that, back and forth. So some of them stay still, some of them move. And so in Super Rainbow Reef, we learned first about inheritance. Now, objects may have methods, although some languages call them functions. Methods define what an object is able to do. It's a similar concept in GameMaker's events and actions. So you would have a moved fixed on a action related to an event like a key press or a collision or something like that. In this case, a koala, I can tell if I had a keyboard action down, I would move fixed speed 4 in the downward direction. Methods may also make decisions for an object. In this case, we've got the question asked, what should happen if Object Explorer collides with various other objects? So here we have the Explorer, and here are events. There's a collision, there's a collision, there's a collision, there's a collision with wall 1, enemy, horizontal block, or vertical block. The game has to make decisions if any of those collisions takes place. And so let's talk more about methods here. A method may repeat a sequence over and over. We call this a loop. Most programming languages have loops. GameMaker, the loops are pretty much implied. You could do a script that does something like that, but in general, you don't need to code loops in GameMaker. Loop, for example, is if the up key is pressed, move forward, then repeat. Check to see if the up key is pressed. If it is, move forward, repeat. Check to see if the up key is pressed, move forward. Just do it constantly. Objects may also have things called functions. GameMaker's functions are also events and actions. Functions define what an object can know. Let's say, for example, the Explorer object needs to know, am I touching an enemy? So it checks the collision with object enemy to determine that function. Pyramid Panic has a class called enemy. And an enemy is defined as any object that kills one player life when it collides with Object Explorer. And so we're back to looking at this code. Here's Object Enemy. There are no events, there are no actions in Object Enemy. What the heck is going on here, Mike? Well, all of the events and actions in Pyramid Panic are in the Explorer here that check to see the collision with enemies. So what the heck is this thing? Execute a piece of code when the Explorer collides with an object enemy, we execute a piece of code. All right, that piece of code is going to be Game Maker Language, GML. And let's have a look at it now. The piece of code that gets executed when the Explorer collides with any of those object enemies, whether it's the scorpion or the mummy or the scarab or whatever, it plays the sound called sound die. This can't be good. It subtracts one life. Lives minus equals 1. That is GML code for subtract one life from the player. It redraws the screen here, and then it pauses for 1 second. Let's go over it. These steps are being followed in order. It plays that sound. It subtracts a life. It's redrawing the screen. Then it says sleep 1000. That's pausing 1 second. It's 1,000 1,000ths of a second. Then it returns to the X and Y start position. So players' X and Y value go to X start and Y start. And it does a move snap 32-32 so that it goes to the center of the block 32-32. You've seen that in different Game Maker games. And then it destroys the instance of enemy that you collided with. So you did take out the enemy while you died in this case. Let's now talk about the biggest loop of all in object-oriented programming games. A true object-oriented programming language will have a main loop, or so most programmers say. It's one of these loop things that just runs through the whole thing. Show something to the player. Check the player's reaction. Pushing buttons on the keyboard, clicking the mouse, operating a controller. Then repeat it forever and ever and ever as long as the game is running. That is the main loop in a program. A main loop is repeated steps that accept input and produce output. That's it. That's the definition of a main loop. Input could be from the keyboard, the mouse, a network packet in the case of like an MMORPG, whatever. Output changes the image on a screen. Make a sound effect. Any kind of output that the player can detect with their eyeballs or ears or tactile, whatever, that's output. Now, Game Maker, like all loops, hides the main loop from the programmer. You don't really experience that you're creating a main loop, but you've had one all the way back from Evil Clutches in this class. So the main loop does this. When you start the game, you set up the game. Put objects into their room or whatever. Set the variables, score equals 0, lives equal 5, whatever goes into setting up the game. Then you check for input from the player. In most of our Game Maker games, that means checking the keyboard. Then you update the variables. Does something move on the X and Y? Does something get fired or whatever? Then you update the display. Okay, we move that bullet a little bit. We move the enemy a little bit. Check to see, did the game just end? If not, if it did, you end the game. You can exit the main loop. If the game didn't end, we keep that main loop going. We check for input from the player again. And on it goes until the game ends. That is the way to break out of that loop. Okay, let's look at a main loop in Alice. Alice does not hide the main loop from the programmer. You get to see it here, loop infinity times. And this is the program we saw last week when we looked at the carpal tunnel syndrome simulation with the fingers moving and the wrist at various different positions. So the loop is going tendon 1, tendon 2, and tendon 3. You see those 3 tendons up there? They move up and down and repeat forever. And while they're moving, the fingers and the joints are moving. And so it's doing infinity times. For the duration of 1 second, the tendons move up. And then for the duration of 1 second, the tendons move down, up a second, down a second, up a second, down a second. And it repeats that forever. So let's show you very quickly a game in Alice. When I took this class, my final project was to create a game in Alice where you drove a submarine around and tried to sink ships with torpedoes. So I've just launched my game. My submarine is moving there on the screen. I'm giving orders to make left turns. And oh, there's a ship out there in the fog. I'm going to say fire 1. I hit the 1 key. A torpedo has just launched at that ship. It goes out in 3D space. It hits the enemy ship. And the enemy ship is now burning and slowed down. I'm going to turn a little bit more. Fire 2. Hitting the enemy ship with another torpedo. Let's see what happens. And now it's really, really burning. There's a huge flame on board that ship. All right, let's turn a little more. Fire a torpedo further forward. Fire 3. Hit that enemy ship. Oh, the flames are enormous now. I may not be able to sink this guy. Fire 4. See how much damage we can do. All right. Well, I think that's about all she wrote for that game. Let's look at the code very quickly here. So I've got these events in the world in Alice. When the world starts, do world my first method. My first method is the main loop in this game. So it first goes through setting the instructions, the camera positions, the submarine, and all those things. Then here is the main loop. Loop infinity times. So it checks to see if there's a fire, and it'll rotate the fire. The big boat, there are 3 boats and 1 destroyer, and they move at speed. They move forward at speed, whatever the speed is. The more damage it takes, the slower it goes. And the submarine will move forward at whatever speed the submarine's going. And then if the destroyer is within range of the submarine, the destroyer will fire. And all of these steps, and many more, so many things, get repeated over and over and over. And down here, if the right conditions exist, then the ship gets sunk or the player dies, and then back to the top and do it all again. It's constantly doing all these things. That is the main loop for that game in Alice. Hope you've got some concept of object-oriented programming and the terminology involved from our presentation today. But that's all we have for today. This is our last That main loop was the last new material you were going to learn this semester. Other than some homework assignments, if you haven't done the scavenger hunts yet, you'll learn a little bit about the game design industry locally. Next week, lecture will be the final exam review in the spirit of a game development class. Next week will be a game. Everybody who shows up here will be playing a game in the classroom, and the game will ask you questions from the final exam. So if you know the answers to the questions, you will score well. And there are no consequences to scoring badly. But the consequences to scoring well is I will give you a candy bar. So next week you have some incentive to know the material in this class. Whether you know it or not, you will see a bunch of questions that will be asked on the final exam. Not all of the questions, but you will see questions from the final exam, and you will have a chance to review stuff. So until next week, this is Mike Substelny signing off for Intro to Computer Games and Simulations here at Lorain County Community College.